And now, to introduce our 2 o'clock Interfaith lecture series here in the Hall of Philosophy, where this week we are presenting the theme, Food and Faith. Our distinguished guest today is Rabbi Jonathan Brumberg-Kraus. Rabbi Brumberg-Kraus is a professor of religion and coordinator of Jewish studies at Wheaton College in Massachusetts. His research focuses on meals and religion, especially on the cognitive, sensory, and communal dimensions of meal rituals. He has published numerous articles on ancient, medieval, and modern Jewish food in the Proceedings of the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery, in Studies in Jewish Civilization, in Meals in Early Judaism, Social Formation at the Table, and in Writing Food History, A Global Perspective. He has also published in encyclopedias and in journals. His book on Jewish food and identity, Culinary Midrash, What Makes Jewish Food? What Makes Food Jewish? Is forthcoming, so look for it. He translated Rabbanu Baya ben Basher in 14th century Hebrew mystical manual on food, the Shulchan Shel Arba, meaning the table of four, into English. In addition to holding a PhD in religious studies in New Testament from Vanderbilt, he is ordained as a Reconstructionist rabbi. Rabbi Professor Brumberg-Kraus lives in Providence, Rhode Island with his wife Maya, whom we are happy to have with us, and his 2 grown children. He cooks, ferments, gardens, performs holiday and life cycle rituals, and teaches, and is often lucky enough to get to combine them all. For over 20 years, he has taught a first-year seminar at Wheaton College on the rituals of dinner, which has been a kind of lab in which he has learned much from his students and colleagues about how to put the theories into practice about the friend-making power of food to make and sustain meaningful and ethical communities, as well as how to put the practice into theory. For the next 2 years, he will co-chair the Wheaton Interdisciplinary Institute in the Humanities with his colleague and playwright Charlotte Meehan in the English and theater departments there, focused on the topic of interpretation and its expressive modes in the arts, religions, and secular cultures. The title of Rabbi Brumberg-Kraus's lecture today is Food, Faith, and Fellowship, Connecting to Human and Other Than Human Beings Through Taste. We are grateful to the Joan Brown Campbell Department of Religion Endowment for providing funding for this week's Interfaith lectures. And I don't know if our Joan is here, but let's give her a round of applause as we remember her lovingly as our former director of the Department of Religion. The Department of Religion is greatly pleased to welcome Jonathan to this podium, and so please now join me in welcoming Rabbi Jonathan Brumberg-Kraus.
Thank you, Maureen, and the Department of Religion, Dr. Franklin, and all of the people involved in the Department of Religion at Chautauqua for being such a wonderful hosts and giving me this opportunity. And also, I want to thank my parents who are here in the audience, who, because of their visit to Chautauqua Institution last year, inspired me to say, hey, I want to come here and speak. And so here it is. So without further ado, because who knows what kind of weather we're going to get, I'll just jump right in. There are 3 basic points I want to make today about food, faith, and fellowship. First, faith, or what I prefer to call religion, literally from the Latin that means that which ties together, is primarily concerned with relationships rather than simply belief in things unseen, even though that is what religion is for many people. Graham Harvey, as one modern scholar of religion, Graham Harvey puts it, drawing upon the interpretations of the indigenous traditions of the Native American Anishinaabe, religion is about respecting relations between human and other than human persons. These other than human persons may be gods, dead ancestors, non-human animals, vegetables or minerals, or places. A striking expression of this is New Zealand's recognition after 140 years of negotiation with the Maoris that a particular river has the same legal rights as human beings. Secondly, food too is a fundamental and daily way we relate to humans and other than human beings. At the most basic biological level, eating requires us to make the important distinction between what is food and what is not. Our evolutionary selected, hardwired human animal instincts equip us to recognize what to eat, with whom to mate, and whom to avoid as predators. Like all animals, we must determine what is food and what is not. However, we are also a social species. So shared food, along with language, allow us to connect and to function together as groups whose collaboration is mutually beneficial for our survival, particularly vis-a-vis other groups, humans and other than human. Think pathogenic microbes, or the woodchucks, deer, and bunnies eating our garden vegetables, among others, who are competing with us for the same resources. So eating typically draws implicit or explicit boundaries between those with whom we eat and those with whom we do not, at least not yet. My third point is that we are connected to others in very physical and material ways, through taste, or better, flavor. Strictly speaking, taste refers to what our taste buds pick up and process: sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and umami, a savory sort of meaty quality. What we loosely refer to as taste is really flavor, a multisensory experience of taste, smell, texture, so-called mouthfeel, and even sound and visual appearance. Think of the crunch of potato chips or fried foods, or the observation of many chefs that we first begin to taste with our eyes. That said, I want to emphasize particularly for this talk the experiences of the senses of taste, smell, and touch in flavor. And so I'll use the term taste and flavor interchangeably. Taste, touch, and smell, at least for us human persons, require much more intimate contact with the things or beings we taste, touch, and smell. We have to put things into our bodies to taste them, rub against them to touch them, and we have olfactory receptors in our mouths as well as in our nose that make what we ordinarily experience as taste possible. Without looking, if you have a stuffy nose, you really can't tell the difference between an apple and an onion, or so they say. I seem to remember an elementary school experiment doing that. It's this intimacy that the first lines of the Song of Songs in the Bible poetically evokes for me. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your kisses are better than wine. The Song of Songs is famous for its food metaphors for the joys of physical intimacy. That parallel between the taste, aroma, and mouthfeel of kisses and wine is not coincidental. Taste is affective, embodied, and material. Moreover, we can't taste, smell, or touch things unless they give off something of themselves that is tasteable, smellable, or touchable. Likewise with sight and sound. What we experience through our senses, like religion, involves us in relationships if we have the eyes, ears, noses, and throats to see them. And our evolutionary survival depends on our instinctive taste and other sensory connections to the world and its inhabitants. For it's our sense experiences that preconsciously trigger us to fight or flight, to embrace, to ingest, to avoid or expel in disgust. In short, to distinguish between what helps and harms us and to act accordingly. Again, is it coincidence that the Bible attributes our ability to distinguish between good and evil to an act of eating fruit from the tree of knowledge? Granted, the biblical text gives us a mixed message about whether or not that acquisition of knowledge was a good or a bad thing. After all, on the one hand, it elevates us with the capacity to be like God, as it says, and the Lord God said, "Behold, the human has become like one of us in knowing good and evil." But on the other hand, it came about through the violation of the one taboo, a dietary taboo that God put on the first humans to eat that fruit, or to not eat that fruit. And we're punished for it by being exiled from paradise and the painful consequences of a gender binary, the labor of sweaty work for our bread for males, and the labor of natural childbirth for females. But I digress. Or do I? Isn't this punishment basically a backstory for the earthy, painful material circumstances of our human condition living in this real world? Whatever spin we put on it, and even with the technological advances that have eased our conditions, we humans now do have to work to eat. We give birth painfully. We die. We fear creatures that might endanger us. And at times we feel exiled, displaced, alienated from some better times and places that aging or moving have taken us from. How much the more so for those of us who are immigrants and the descendants of immigrants. Religion and eating converge both in calling attention to the necessary separations we have to live in this world, food, foe, or friend, and in connecting us to the same world which we need and which needs us for our sustenance and survival. As the folk singer Mark Graham wittily puts in his song, Working on the Food Chain, "You are what you eat, but you also are what eats you." But does that make eating a kind of religion? Yes, that's pretty much the thesis of this talk. Or better, eating is, or at least can be, a way of being religious. Or even better, eating, the stories we tell about it, and the taboos we attach to it are ways of being religious in the world. Of course, to make this case, I have to be clear on what my definition of religion is. I've already stated a definition of religion as respecting relations between humans and other than human persons, which I'll expand upon shortly. But before that, I anticipate objections to my thesis that eating is a way of being religious in the world. Thus, some of you might be thinking, I'm not religious, so how can you say my eating is religious? Or, I don't practice a particular religion, though maybe I was raised in a family that was, but I'm spiritual. And what's so spiritual about doing something that we have to do, like eating? Or, being spiritual or non-religious means not being constrained by outdated and authoritarian rules about what I can't eat or drink or with whom I should or shouldn't. Or, if eating is a kind of religion, isn't that like saying everyone is religious, whether they think so or not? Isn't that a bit presumptuous on my part? Or if eating is itself religious, what then are Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, Jainism, Santeria, and all the other things that we normally call religions? If everything is religious, what's the point of defining anything as religious? And I'm sure there are other objections that you may have that I haven't anticipated or mentioned, and so you'll ask me in the question period. For now, let me reiterate the three main points of my argument, and then I'll dig deeper into each, getting into more concrete examples of what I mean. 1, religion is primarily concerned with relationships, namely respecting relations between human and other than human persons, rather than simply belief in things unseen. 2, food is fundamental and is a fundamental and daily way we relate to humans and other than human beings. And 3, the way food does what I say it does is especially through taste, or better, the combination of all of our senses and what we experience as flavor. Therefore, to the extent that eating and the activities associated with it function in the way that I say religions do, eating is a way of being religious. Did I repeat that enough for you all? So, religion's about relationships. In defining religion as respecting relations between human and other than human persons, I have adopted a definition of religion that does not put faith at the center of religion. Of course, some religions do, namely Christianity, and the currents in other modern religions that have been influenced by Protestant Christianity. But as recent critics within this academic study of religion have shown, like Graham Harvey in his book, food, sex, and strangers, understanding religion as everyday life, Christianity, especially Protestant Christianity's emphasis on faith as the defining feature of religion, is the exception rather than the rule, in contrast to most world religions. Moreover, because the modern critical study of religion emerged in Protestant Christian Europe, even those scholars who abandoned their Christian faith, or who were themselves not from Christian backgrounds, carried over the bias of stressing belief or faith as a central, if not the definitive component of religion. Even modern atheists define themselves by their non-belief, the literal meaning, by their non-belief in God, the literal meaning of atheism. In his book, Harvey challenges this norm in the Western critical study of religion by asking, what if we looked at and defined religions through the eyes of non-Western theorists and practitioners of religion? In many non-Western, especially indigenous religions, faith in other than human beings, and not only supernatural beings, is not required. Humans and other than human persons are simply assumed. They're no less real to them than you and I, than you are to me when we're speaking and hearing each other. There are four ways that Graham Harvey describes religion, drawn from non-Western understandings of it, that are especially pertinent to my discussion of religion, of eating as a way of being religious. First, there's the one that I've already mentioned from the Anishinaabe tradition, that religion is respecting relations between humans and other than human beings. The second is drawn from the Maori theorist of religion, Te Pakaka Tauhai. Religion is doing violence with impunity. Lest we misunderstand his point and miss its relevance, Tauhai's full quotation is, quote, "The purpose of religious activity is to seek to enter the domain of superbeing and do violence with impunity. For example, to enter the forest and do some milling for building purposes, to husband the plant, and then to dig up the tubers to feed one's guests." Here, Tauhai is speaking specifically about cutting down trees or harvesting sweet potatoes to serve guests in the building that you build with those trees. Removing plants from their homes in the forest or soil are acts of violence, even if done for good social reasons. Harvey goes on to explain Tauhai's point. To do violence to trees in Kumara, sweet potatoes, is not a neutral act. Properly undertaken, it requires that permission is gained, and this is not given just because someone says please. Placation is also required and may involve the making of apologies, the respectful treatment of trees and tubers, including those parts not required for building or eating, and addressed to the kin of those cut down or dug up. What Tauhai identifies as religious activity is what someone does to make threatened beings, that is, trees and Kumara, less hostile and perhaps even happily willing to give up life to others. There's a lot packed into this analysis, too much to go into the detail it deserves. Suffice it to say that to prepare places and foods to eat communally necessarily involves acts of violence that cannot and should not be ignored. Or as Michael Pollan puts it in The Omnivore's Dilemma, there is a karmic price to pay for eating animals and plants. I hope this isn't the karmic price to pay, whether we recognize it or not. Industrial agriculture and the food, I'm laughing because I thought that having a total solar eclipse would be a challenge from the natural environment to giving a talk in here. And clearly that was nothing compared to having very loud stormy winds blowing. Anyway, what Michael Pollan argues is that there is a karmic price to pay, whether we recognize it or not. Industrial agriculture and food processing banks on our ignorance of this cost for us, to enjoy the food, while mindful eating requires the opposite. Or as I pointed out earlier, the biblical story in the Garden of Eden reminds us that there is a cost for tasting the difference between good and evil in order to survive in the real world. A third definition or purpose of religion is to make strangers into guests, that is, intimates. Indeed, that is one way to engage in religious activity, to make threatened beings, that is ourselves, less hostile, and perhaps even happily willing to give up life to others, not to mention threatening beings, strangers made into guests, willing not to kill us. Though I have my doubts. What did I do? Or what did we do? Okay, so, but religions with their taboos about whom we do and don't eat with and sleep with also engage us in the very activities that make strangers strange and make them into others in the first place. Well, religion is not nice, as Harvey rightly says. That said, while making these boundaries, religion offers us ways to smooth the crossing or transgression of these boundaries, especially in communal eating. For example, to remember the crucified Christ by eating his body and blood in the bread and wine of the Eucharist is a communion of people with one another and with God, with human and other than human persons. Which brings me to my fourth definition of religion as etiquette in the real world. Graham Harvey's definition that draws all the other ones together. To be precise, this is how Harvey puts it. Y'all can still hear me? I feel like I'm in a contest, and I feel like nature's winning. Maybe I should just go with it. All right, I'll try, but I guess we'll know if nature wins. Religion, as the etiquette of relating within a multi-species world, is diffused through the lives of embodied, located, and performative persons. It entails negotiations between the need to consume others and the need to maintain both diversity and larger-than-human community. How are we doing?
All right, let's go.
Okay, so we'll strike while the iron is hot. I hope you forgive me for being close to my paper. One, I want to hold on to it before it goes into the lake. And two, I have bifocals, which have made it difficult to read this. And finally, I'll give my Jewish religious reason. Is that my grandfather said when you're reading prayers, or you should always have a prayer book in front of you, even if you memorize the words. And so I'll go with that reason. That's a good one. Okay, so I'm probably not going to do everything that I plan to, but I will finish a little bit, give you some of the examples, and then maybe open it for questions. Okay, so I'll finish with Graham Harvey's definition, because I do really like it, even though I probably can't say it without choking on it. Religion is the etiquette of relating within a multi-species world. As the etiquette of relating within a multi-species world is diffused through the lives of embodied, located, and performative persons. It entails negotiations between the need to consume others and the need to maintain both diversity and larger-than-human community. It entails negotiations between intimates and strangers, both often defined when rules are made explicit about who can legitimately have sex with whom, and I would add, who can eat with whom, or who can eat whom, as well. Now, that's certainly a mouthful, as I said, but it touches on all the important points where religion and eating converge, recognizing that we share space and live in a community of humans and other than human persons, that doing so necessarily involves doing violence with impunity, that ideally we try to make intimates or guests of strangers, and we do so as embodied material beings in specific locations that we can taste, touch, smell, hear, and see with our senses. That is the real world. The last point cannot be emphasized enough. To see religion, or to suggest a better alternative as mostly spiritual, wrenches us out of the material, physical reality that it's the point of religion to help us live in. Eating and the activities associated with it keep us grounded in the embodied, material, located reality. The biggest obstacle to sensing the spirituality of food and meals is the word spiritual itself. We often think of spiritual as something opposed to the flesh, to materiality. But the spirituality of food, what and whom it connects us to, is something we experience precisely through its materiality, through our embodied senses, taking it in its very physicality. In Jewish Hasidic tradition, this is called avodah begashmiut, worship or service through materiality. It is our physical engagement with physical things, or should I say physical beings, that lifts our spirits. That's the sense that it's spirituality. If alienation, loneliness, dislocation, separation from loved ones, hostility directed at ourselves and at others are at the base of the most painful aspects of our human condition, then connection is what relieves it. Connecting to the work of our hands, to our missed loved ones, to lost homes, to all kinds of humans and other than human persons uplifts us. Our senses connect us to all of these because they take us on a two-way street. As I said before, we can taste, smell, touch, hear, and see things, sense them only because we have the physiological receptors to do so, but also because these things, these beings, have something to give off to us. As David Abram beautifully and compellingly develops this point in his book, The Spell of the Sensuous, we are not simply subjects acting upon inanimate objects, but rather subjects connecting with other subjects, beings interacting with human and other than human beings. But this sense of connection is ever so much more possible, so much more plausible, so much more palpable through our mindful, sensual, and multisensory activities of eating. Hence the psalmist's synesthetic metaphor, taste the Lord and see that he is good. So how is eating food about relationships? I'm going to say a little bit about that, and then I'm going to cut to the end of my paper, and then I'm going to go to questions. What kinds of relationships do eating and activities associated with it, such as preparing, cooking, growing, blessing, and talking about food, cultivate and enact? Relationships with fellow humans, with the animals, vegetables, or minerals, and other elements like water we eat and drink, as well as the plants and animals with whom we share these resources. With the places where the foods come from, soil, climate, local human and bacterial cultures, rivers, mountains, terroir. Not to mention the air and seas, and with the gods, God, ancestors, nature spirits. You get the idea. Perhaps we don't all consider these entities persons, as my definition of religion would have it, but I'm arguing that the activities of eating engage us in interactions with them as if they were persons. Moreover, isn't it awfully presumptuous to assume the chicken whose eggs and flesh we eat, the birds, squirrels, wasps, and woodchucks that inhabit our vegetable gardens, or even the plants we cull, trim, and harvest don't acknowledge or react to our presence in some way? Recent studies of trees and mushrooms suggest that collectively they communicate with one another, albeit in ways quite different from how our physiologies equip us to do it, to respond to threats, to their survival. Conscious or unconscious, our acts of eating put into play ways of respecting and disrespecting these relations, doing violence with impunity, making strangers into intimates, and etiquette in the real world. So let's get concrete. I can think of 4 kinds of physical spaces in particular associated with eating that engage us in the performance of these negotiations and connections. The kitchen, the garden, markets, and finally, the table itself. I have great examples for this, but I'm not going to go, maybe we'll have a chance to do them in the question and answers, but definitely I'll say that when you're making things together and when you're shopping together, it involves you in conversations with people, in direct human interaction. And I don't know if any of you went to the discussion on markets this morning. One of the reasons why I think markets are important, particularly markets that particularly brick and mortar markets, is that they are places where you interact with other people to get your food. And I think it's dangerous for us to forget that that's what is involved. I'm going to cut right to ways at the table we interact. So here we go. Okay, at the table. Because that's where I get to bring in the Jewish stuff. And since I'm the Jewish perspective on food, I thought you should get what you bargained on. Although this is Chautauqua, maybe I should say something about civility and politics. You want me to say something about that? Okay. All right. Here we go. At the table, sharing food, words, and indeed the very air we breathe creates a different, more intimate relationship between the participants, which tends to curb our potentially more hostile instincts to one another. Sharing food at the same table has a friend-making power. That is, makes guests and intimates of strangers. You heard a couple of examples of this already. Well, you heard them in other people's talks because you didn't get to hear my examples. One contemporary political theorist, Janet Fleming, has argued in her book, Table Talk, Building Democracy One Meal at a Time, that shared meals are a cornerstone of democracy. For example, she cites the practice of the recently retired U.S. Senator from Maryland, Barbara Mikulski, to organize regular bipartisan meals for her fellow Democratic and Republican senators, to which Fleming attributes their greater ability to compromise and work together across party lines, even in the recent hyperpolarized Congress. And you all remember that seemed to have had an effect. Similarly, she laments how the declining use by Congress members of the Senate and House dining rooms in the Capitol building have probably contributed to the gridlock and unwillingness to compromise in today's Congress, and recalls how deep friendships across party lines, like by such ideologically opposed senators as Democrat Ted Kennedy and Republican Orrin Hatch, used to develop over dinners in and out of the Capitol building. Fleming also argues in Table Talk and in her earlier book, The Taste for Civilization, Food, Politics, and Civil Society, that family dinners play a crucial role in educating us in the rules of civility. Thanks, Mom and Dad. Taking turns speaking at the table, not interrupting one another, showing interest in what each person at the table has to say, children and adults, family members and guests alike, not saying or doing things at the table that would cause participants to lose their appetites or to deliberately hurt or offend others at the table. Now, are all our family meals like that? Of course not. After the divisive presidential election of 2016, many people from red and blue parts of the country alike expressed their apprehension about conversations and tensions they knew they were going to have at Thanksgiving dinner. Still, the family table is where many of us first learn the ideals of civil behavior, even if we don't always live up to them. And as much as I love the idea of culinary diplomacy, I am not so naive to think that meals can smooth over every issue that might divide people. But at the same time, I take heart that one of the responses taken across the country on a grassroots level to the hateful things being said about and done to Muslim immigrants and citizens of the U.S. was an effort on the part of many American Muslims to invite non-Muslims to dinner, to get to know a Muslim is, basically what people were saying. So I think sharing meals like this in a small way is a small way to make good the implicit violence that divides us religiously, culturally, and economically. What we say about our food also at the table, what we say about food itself at the table also cultivates respect for our relations between humans and other than human persons. In religious communities, prayers of gratitude are pretty much de rigueur at the table. But even at the sustainable banquet Michael Pollan describes as a sort of secular Seder at the omnivore's dilemma, other words at the table did the trick. In my favorite passage of the book, Powell says, I love this passage. As the conversation at the table unfurled like a sail amid the happy clatter of silver, tacking from stories of hunting to mother loads of mushrooms to abalone adventures, I realized that in this particular case, words of grace were unnecessary. As you might expect from this crowd and occasion, the talk at the table was mostly about food. Yet this was not the usual food talk you hear nowadays, less about recipes in restaurants. It revolves around specific plants and animals and fungi, the places where they lived. The stories told by this little band of foragers ventured a long way from the table. The words, the taste too, recalling us to an oak forest in Sonoma, to a pine burn in the Sierra Nevada, to the stinky salt flats of the San Francisco Bay, to slippery boulders on the Pacific coast, and to a backyard in Berkeley. The stories, like the food that fed them, cast lines of relation to all these places and the creatures living and dying in them, drawing them all together at the table on these plates in what to me began to feel a little like a ceremony. And there's a sense in which the meal had become just that, a Thanksgiving or a secular Seder, for every item on our plates pointed somewhere else, almost sacramentally, to tell a little story about nature or community or even the sacred, for mystery was often the theme. Such storied food can feed us both body and soul, the threads of narrative knitting us together as a group and knitting the group into the larger fabric of the world. In Jewish tradition, we have specific blessings for specific kinds of foods. A blessing for bread, for the fruits of the vine, the fruit of the tree, for the fruit of the earth, for food cooked from different ingredients, for eating the bitter herb and matzah at the Passover Seder, and a grace after meals. We even have a catch-all food blessing for any foods that don't fit neatly into the other categories. Shehakol, blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, by whose word everything comes into being. But I find particularly attractive the Jewish mystical interpretation of the rabbinic tradition about food blessings. Whoever enjoys food from the world without saying a blessing, it's if they have stolen from the sacrifices to God on the altar in the temple. The Jewish mystics take this to refer to their idea that all the material things of God's creation have something of divine energy animating them. Thus, when we eat something, we have to restore that divine energy to its divine source, which we do so by reciting the proper blessings for the food we ate. The blessing itself forms a conduit for the energy to flow back up to God in a sort of cosmic recycling. Since according to medieval Kabbalah, this divine energy flows up and down in 10 streams, the so-called 10 sfirot, there are particular table blessings and accompanying actions that focus attention on this process. So there's a ritual practice for washing hands that Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher, the person I translated into English, that you can find this online, on how to do this, to do a ritual of washing your hands before you eat the bread. So I don't have bread in front of me, but I do have hands, so I'll use those props. Okay, so first of all, how many fingers do I have? How many toes do I have? How many sfirot are there? Okay, just remember those numbers, they're important. Okay, now the prayer for blessing, can you all hear me? I'm sorry, I'm going away from, I had to move away from the microphone to perform. The blessing over washing your hands literally says, blessed are you, God, who commanded us, Lord our God, who commanded us to, concerning the raising of the hands. So Rabbeinu Bachya says, when you do this blessing, before you eat bread, you lift your hands up to the heavens. Okay, so there's 10 streams of God coming down. So where are they coming? And they're going from my fingers and my toes. Okay, so now I am a living, embodied carrier of the 10 sfirot. Then, according to Bachya, I'm supposed to grab the 2 loaves of challah, or 2 loaves of bread, symbolizing or commemorating the double portion of manna that the Israelites got on the night before the Sabbath. I grab them with my 2 hands. How many fingers? Okay. And then I say a blessing. If you know the blessing, the Hamotzi blessing, you can think in your mind, count the words. How many words? Baruch, Atah, Adonai, Eloheinu, Melech, Ha'olam, Hamotzi, Lechem, Min, Haaretz. 10 words. And the verse that's drawn from the Psalms, Psalm 104, verse 14, that what has the expression, who brings forth bread from the earth in it, also has 10 words. So I'm going like this, bringing down the 10 sefirot, holding the bread, and when I say the blessing, okay, now you can hear me, the 10 words, going back up, I've just done cosmic recycling. Cool, isn't it? Okay, so whether or not you believe all of the mythology behind this, the fact is, you certainly feel it in your hands, hear it, feel it in your mouth, hear it in your ears, and taste it in the challah, which I make, or our friends make every week. It's very palpable. It's a perfect example of the sensual dimension of words to connect humans and other than human persons in a material world. As Graham Harvey and Thomas Shortis put it, to speak is to act. Words are not merely expressive but sensuous, not merely representational but presencing. Speaking is a kind of sonorous touching. Language is the tissue and the flesh of the world. Or to be more graphic, think of language as a bodily secretion. And if there's a suspiciously erotic connotation to this proposition, I can only remind you how we refer to speaking as intercourse and the double meaning contained therein. Religious speeches are among the actions in which humans really engage the world. So even the words we utter and hear at the table bring us persons closer to one another in very real, sensual, material ways. They accentuate, enhance, and affect how we experience the pleasures of ingesting food and drink through our mouths. Indeed, noting this affinity and the complementary effect of the combined eating and speaking and singing rituals characteristic of the Jewish Passover Seder, one Hasidic commentator, the Sfas Emes, called these all mitzvot with the mouth. Mitzvah being the Hebrew word for commandment, as well as more colloquially for a good deed. Or shall we say, mouth etiquette for the real world. So I'm really at the end now. Thus, what I really should say is, if what I have said is true, may there be some kind of signs from the heaven that there's actually a very famous midrash about that, and in fact, the rabbis rejected the signs from the heaven, so I'm not going to go that way. Thus it is with the very physical, material, sensual rituals of talking and eating at the table and at other places where we prepare our food. We respect the relations between human and other than human persons, account for the violence that we do with impunity, make friends of strangers, in short, practice the etiquette of living in the real world. I believe this is why the medieval Jewish mystics called the revelation of God at Mount Sinai real eating, achila vadait in Hebrew, based on their interpretation of Genesis 24:11. They had a vision of God and they ate and drank. Now, the mystics didn't read grammar right. They decided this wasn't sequential, this was simultaneous. It was so real that those who witnessed this revelation, can taste it. And so can we, if we have the mouths, eyes, noses, ears, and fingers to do so. Any questions?
So aren't we grateful that Rabbi Brumberg-Kraus stayed with us and continued to help us relate not just to our senses, which I think you have done magnificently, all our senses, especially tasting, but connecting it to everything. And we have been kind of immersed in sensual experiences with the eclipse yesterday and this, monumental storm today. So if there are any thoughts that you could share about this immersion that we've had, and especially relative to Rabbi Brumberg-Kraus's helping us to understand how important it is to be aware of our own senses, especially with this basic thing that we do every day, multiple times a day, that we sometimes do too mechanically and don't think about. You've really helped us to become more aware and appreciative, I think. So any thoughts? You might come to the microphones, which are a little closer today, and just share what your responses are.
Rabbi, thank you so much. Absolutely wonderful. And I really agree with you about the sensual and practice nature of religion. I was struck by I'm a Protestant Christian, and I was struck by what you said about Protestants being one of the few religions in the world that sees faith as being central, belief as being central, and which was disturbing to me. But one part of Protestantism, though, is also going back to early Christianity, which was all about eating. I mean, from what I understand, early Christian communities would sit around in a circle and share food with each other, an agape meal. And so food and sharing food and that kind of civility and equality were central. And I also am upset about kind of the creeping in of Gnosticism that split body and soul. And my question to you is, you work in a university, don't you? And my question is our age, especially with young people with all of the instruments that we have, are we becoming more Gnostic and more split? Or are we able to find our way back home?
Thank you for your question. I'm glad you raised the point about Protestantism. I knew coming to Chautauqua and saying what I was going to say about Protestantism was probably going to at least raise some eyebrows. I mean, it is the way that many people are religious. It's just not the way that everybody is religious. And it's also more a matter of an emphasis, as you said. As for Gnosticism, I don't know whether I should tell you this, but my son, who I raised in all of these habits, he calls himself at times a Gnostic, although what he means by that is probably not what the ancient Gnostics said. So I don't know. But I agree with your point, is that I think, and that really was the point of the talk, is that I think it's really problematic, this the split, this making a split between mind and body. And I think it is right that the virtual reality has helped accomplish that. There are things that you would say and do online to one another that you would never do at the dinner table with people that you're sharing the same air and food with. And so that's, we're not going to change everything. And actually there's certain ways, it's not, it's like anything else that humans have created. It can be for good and evil. And there are very nice things about Facebook and other social media. But at the same time, in terms of encouraging civility, I think being grounded in our relationships with other people and feeling the sense of sharing with them materially does make it harder to do violence to them.
I'm sorry I was late getting here. I was swimming upstream, and it took a while.
You're a salmon?
Yeah, right. But I was thinking about the Last Supper as you were describing, and I was wondering if you would mind compare, because Jewish traditions and Christians, as far as our Last Supper and communion and so forth, and Jewish traditions with their religious meals, wonder if you could compare those a little bit?
You really want me to do this? I wrote my PhD dissertation on this. And I've been trying really hard not to wear my academic hat. I probably failed. But they're similar. They come out of the same context. The authors of the New Testament are quite aware of what other Jewish groups at the same time were doing. The Passover Seder, as we know it, was also being formed, so it's not like there was a fixed Passover Seder at the same time that the gospel writers at least were writing about the Last Supper. I wrote about Luke and his version of the Last Supper, in which he emphasizes table talk and the symbolic foods. And so I think he was aware of something comparable to the early rabbinic Seder that also emphasized table talk and saying things about the food at the table. But also, that was a really important part of how the early Christian Jews and the Pharisaic Jews, or other Jews, also the Essenes, differentiated themselves from one another was through their distinctive meal practices. And in particular, that was a turning point for the growing Christian community, because one of the big issues as Gentiles started coming and becoming part of the new movement was, could Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians eat together? And it was decided that it would be better if they could. I mean, Paul was always arguing about trying to set aside the rules of eating that separated people that separated members of the Christian community from one another. Does that help a little? I won't ask you to read my dissertation, but it actually is available if you can find online if you want.
Okay, I have a question.
You do?
I was wondering if you could think from your own experience and describe one time that a meal, could have been any time in your life, embodied some of the experiences of communion, the sensory elements that you described, to sort of bring it to earth a little bit.
Do you mean the meal that we had with Balkis in Nazareth?
That could be it. I was thinking maybe something in your childhood.
Okay, I wanted to use that one anyway, so thanks. This is my wife, Maya, who we cook together, we eat together, and I said I wasn't going to give her a shout out because I had all these examples that involved her, but I threw out all my examples, so she's giving me a cue for that. I mean, there's so many, but actually, we had this experience. I was doing research for my Jewish culinary midrash book, and we were in the Galilee in Israel, and a Jewish woman, Abby Rosner, organized a culinary tour for us. And what that involved is bringing us to her friend Balkis' house in Nazareth. Now, Balkis was an Israeli citizen, Arab resident of Nazareth. And so Maya and I and Abby and a couple of other women went over to Balkis'. Well, first we actually went to the market, and we got to shop in the markets. Markets are great. We went to this amazing spice store that had like piles and piles of different color spices that you could smell, and they were grinding bulgur and all the different kinds of the different levels of fineness. And we also picked up some pancakes that we were going to use at Balkis' house to make these special pancakes that you stuff for Ramadan, which was about to come up and at the time. And then at her house, Balkis showed us how to make stuff. And so we were sitting around the table making grape leaves stuffed with frike, which is this kind of green wheat that has a smoky flavor because of the way that you process it. She had homemade cheese that we stuffed, the pastries that we made there. We made this bread that was out of a dough that had nigella seeds and can't remember what else was in it, but we put them in these wooden molds. They made this beautiful shape. And she made a chicken soup with frike in it. And now, Abby had asked us before, do any of us have any dietary restrictions? And we said, well, we wanted to we were vegetarian because we kept kosher. And so actually I had to make a negotiation at that meal am I going to eat Balkis' chicken soup? Because I was pretty sure the meat wasn't kosher, pretty sure it was probably halal. My son says, why don't you just eat halal meat? Kosher's a little stricter and whatever. But I decided, okay, I'm going, well, let's eat the soup, because she's invited us into her house, and also, my stomach got the better of me too. She was clearly a fantastic cook, and I didn't really want to pass that up. But basically, we did that, and it's like, so while we were cooking and making things together, there was a really strong sense of connection, but there was also an awareness that there were certain things we couldn't talk about. And she had mentioned in passing, Balkis had mentioned in passing, the reason why she was living in that house is because her lands, the family lands, were taken away outside. They had farmlands outside of Nazareth, and so they were moving there. And so it was, it was the making things together, was the palpable making things together, making things that tasted good together. There was a lot of conversation. It was very convivial. So that was, I think that was, for me, one of the meals that I've had that's been memorable. You took great pictures of it. But also underline, in very concrete terms, what I'm talking about.
I want to add that one of the most interesting moments at that meal was there were Israeli Jews who lived side by side with Muslims, and in the conversation,
Yeah.
they were talking about Moses and Jesus, and Israeli Jews said, well, you don't believe in that, and the Muslims said, yes, we do. And here are these people who had lived side by side their whole life, and it took this meal to create this tiny kernel of knowledge that they were really lacking.
So eat together with people.
Hi, I hope I can ask this question. It's a little bit out of the maybe context of your presentation, but I'm just very curious. I belong to a very, very large Reform congregation in Michigan, and we had an interesting educational evening at a vegetarian restaurant that was opened by a Jewish cardiologist. And the rabbis led an interesting discussion about, does the Bible intend us to be vegetarian? And what does the text say? Do you have any comment on what the text says and any feeling about that?
I've actually written about it. Yes, and yes, the Bible originally wanted us to be vegetarian. It says that in the creation story that I give you all the grasses to eat and so on, and it's only after the flood that you have this, and that God says, okay, human beings are pretty bloodthirsty. They can eat animals. Fine, it's okay, as long as they pour all the blood out. And so it's very clear, and the tradition understands it as a concession to that. So in a sense, one could argue that a lot of the kosher rules are kind of a Jewish way of doing violence with impunity, if that makes sense. Because, yes, it is recognized that now food and meat in particular is a pretty central part of Jewish cuisine, especially religious cuisine. That said, in practice, I'm a vegetarian outside the house, and that has put me into connection with other vegetarians. My colleague at Wheaton College is a vegan, so whenever we plan food functions, we always make them vegetarian because we feel that's more inclusive. And that was basically Paul's solution to having people from Jewish and Gentile backgrounds is eat veggie, and then you won't get into some of the problems that you're getting into. I think that, and there was the first chief rabbi of Israel, Rav Kook, was vegetarian, but he felt also obligated by later Jewish law that says he's supposed to have some meat on Shabbat, that he would eat reluctantly a little bit of chicken on Shabbat. Maya's laughing because she's waiting for me to break into my really bad Yiddish accent. But anyway, yes, he would eat a little bit of chicken on Shabbat to please God, but hoping that in the Messianic times, oh yeah, by the way, in Messianic times, we won't eat, or at least in some versions of Messianic times, we won't eat meat. The lion will lie down with the lamb, but I hate quoting Woody Allen, but this was kind of funny. The lion will lie down with the lamb, but the lamb won't get much sleep.
Hi. Thanks for your talk and for persisting. My question is, do you have any advice to offer to help somebody who doesn't really enjoy food? That's not me. I'm not talking about me. I love food, good food. But do you have anything to say about that?
That's a great question about what do you say to people who advice to people who don't enjoy food. One of my great experiences in teaching the Rituals of Dinner seminar for like over 20 years at Wheaton College. Yes, I'm going to put out a shout out for Wheaton College because I hear that I may be the first Wheaton person ever to give a talk at here. I don't know if that's true, but if it is, you'll remember it, that it was a Wheaton person who was drowned out by the rain. But anyway, at my first year seminar, I think I'm a kind of person who thinks, oh, how could anybody not like food? And that is where I really had to confront people in my classes that were indifferent to food. And so it's interesting. I mean, I still did my thing. I recognized that they were indifferent for food. For a lot of people, food is just nutrient. Yes, I will read about like the invention of Soylent. Anybody know what Soylent is? Okay, which to me is like the most horrible thing you could possibly imagine for food, but I understand. Well, I do judge, okay, that why some people would think that, it's better to have some kind of food that's only nutritious and so on, and that's for people who are indifferent to food. There are people, it's just not their thing, and I think the advice I would give is that then find something else that links you very concretely. I mean, this person also was an athlete, and so she was engaged in physical activity with people all the time. I'm thinking of a very specific person who was in my first year seminar. You're touching, you're hitting people or whatever, but it's very physical, but it's also very social. And I was also very pleased to find 4 years after she took the first year seminar, we had a reunion and she came and she seemed to like food a little. So maybe something I did had an effect. But does that make sense? Is that I think I like food. Food is a really important way that I think I and many other people can engage nature and reality in these relationships that I think we need to have. But they're not the only ways. And people are different. And they're also, nobody tastes things the same way. Some people lose their sense of taste. As we get older, we lose our ability to taste. Things can happen to us that can affect our sense of smell, all of these different kinds of things. And so, do what you can. And I think, one of the things that I'm trying to remember, the stories about Helen Keller, is that she loved smells and tastes because she didn't have her other senses, and so she talks about what it was like to experience these things. So use the senses that work for you, but engage, connect.
I think we have spent an amazing time together. And I thank you all for sticking with us. I thank you, Rabbi Jonathan, for the food for thought you've given to us today. And we all leave here, I think, much more appreciative and aware. And going home, I think, with more appreciation for our own rituals and what we might want to implement in our lives as new rituals for food. So thank you all. Let's really enjoy this week. And may you all have a wonderful dinner.